Hello, my friends, and welcome to Origins. My name's Don Chapman, and I'm your host. Origins is a forum where we use the evidence of science to validate the truth of creation. Our guest today is a man who has great expertise in what's happening in the atmosphere. Dr. Vardiman has a PhD in atmospheric science.
My specialty is in cloud physics and weather modification.
Physics and weather modification.
I can do forecasting, but I don't particularly enjoy it.
Does anyone do forecasting well?
Well, there are some that are much better than others, but it's hard.
Yeah. But today we're going to talk about the big freeze, and by that you're referring to the Ice Age.
That's right. Many Christians, at least for many years, they recognized that there was a major conflict between the age of the Earth related to the Ice Age, because it's traditionally thought to have occurred hundreds of thousands of years ago and multiple times over millions of years. Well, that conflicts with the clear statements of Scripture, so one of the easiest ways to resolve that is just to basically say there was no Ice Age.
That's not really good research, is it?
No, because the evidence is really very clear.
So you're telling us that there was an Ice Age, and it fits in perfectly with a creation model.
Right, and we're going to show that basically the Ice Age was caused by the Genesis flood.
Let's do it.
Okay. Let me give you a little bit of evidence for the Ice Age actually being, or having occurred first. There are a number of pieces of evidence, including mountain glaciers that still are in existence today. In some of the higher mountains, we still have glaciers today. Now, they were much longer, much further down the mountain in the past, but we still have them today. And there's evidence that they were extending miles downhill from where they are today. We still have a couple of large-size continental ice sheets. Now, an ice sheet is different than a glacier in that a glacier occurs in the valleys and the mountains on steep terrain. Ice sheets occur over flat terrain, like in northern Canada. We believe there was an ice sheet that covered all of northern Canada and much of the United States. But there's still two in existence today. One is in Greenland, and the other one is in Antarctica, down at the South Pole.
And those are two places where the ice never melts, or at least it never melts down so the ground is exposed.
That's right. The conditions are there such that the ice is still permanent. It hasn't melted at all since it was formed. Then there's features that are geologic at the surface of the Earth that were caused by ice sheets and glaciers moving, such as drumlins, which are teardrop shape of dirt that were formed under the ice sheets. There are moraines, which are also kind of ridges or hills, and if you get into the northern part of the United States or in Canada, you can see these for yourself, or in Yosemite National Park. There are places where the glaciers came down and left these ridges of rock and debris behind them. Kettles, you'll find these in the East Coast and in Canada. These are places where there was large chunks of ice left behind by the ice sheets and glaciers, and when they finally melted, there was a depression left in the ground which filled in with water, and they're called kettle lakes. There's other evidences, such as on bedrock in Newfoundland and the East Coast, where ice was coming off the continent into the ocean. It had boulders and rocks embedded in the bottom of it that ground the underlying solid rock and left streaks, and we'll show you some pictures of those in just a moment. And finally, there are what are called erratics. These are boulders that are left out in the field behind where a glacier moved and then melted away, and these large boulders, some of them as big as your house, that are made out of material that was from mountains that were 50 miles away. Here's an example of where one of the glaciers came through during the Ice Age, and this is Yosemite National Park. You might recognize Bridal Veil Falls there. It's a beautiful place. But this valley was actually completely filled with ice during the Ice Age, clear up to the top, up in as high as up in here, not completely covering all the mountains, but was up to there. And if you ever go to Yosemite Park and stand at Glacier Point looking out toward Half Dome, you can see that Half Dome was covered almost completely to the top of it and all the valleys surrounding you. And there's evidence, particularly from the striations or these scratch marks in the rock, that you realize that there was a glacier there in the past. Here's the striations I keep talking about. This was underlying rock in Newfoundland, and as the glacier was moving across the surface heading toward lower elevation and the ocean, it produced these scratches on the surface of the rock, on the top surface. So those are good evidences that there was glaciers in that region in the past. Here's a good illustration of an erratic. This is a very large boulder. If there was a person standing up there, They would probably be about that high to that boulder. So that's a really large boulder, and it's sitting in a very precarious location. You can't imagine how it would have gotten there easily without rolling off the hill. And it's actually made out of a different material than underlying rock, so that the evidence is that it came from a distance of over 50 miles away. It was either ground up or landed on the ice and was moved, and then when the ice melted, it settled into place.
Sure, that makes good sense.
Okay, with all these evidences of ice being covered in various places around the world, we are now able to kind of draw a map in the northern hemisphere where ice coverage occurred at the maximum of the ice age. Conventionally, this is believed to be about 18,000 years ago when the ice reached its max. From a young Earth perspective, I believe this happened about 4,000, maybe 3,500 years ago, after the Genesis flood. In either case, they both occurred, but the timing is in disagreement. For example, here you see in the United States, you have the southern edge of the ice coming clear down into Iowa and Missouri, Illinois, and actually coming south of New York City. Did you know that ice sheets actually covered the Central Park in New York City?
No, I didn't.
And it was over 1,000 feet thick there. It actually covered all the skyscrapers.
1,000 feet of ice. There weren't any skyscrapers.
Not at that time,
No.
no. And you can actually see that because some of the rocks in Central Park actually have striations on them showing the ice having...
We're filming in Pittsburgh. Were we covered with ice?
Yes.
Okay.
Coming down some of these valleys here. And it wasn't as deep, but yes, as you can see, the coverage that comes down to the southeast there in the northeast.
Okay.
It also covered up into Alaska. It covered all of Greenland. It covered all of Canada. And over in Europe, it came down into England and up through Sweden and Norway and over into Russia, and it covered that whole region there. It also covered part of the Himalayas and the high mountain areas, and even some of the mountains in the tropics, right on the equator. The ice caps that are down there were several thousands of feet lower than they are today.
Wow.
But they've melted back since that time.
Even at the equator.
Yes. In the southern hemisphere, there was also an ice sheet that covered, and basically on the average, either the ice sheets or ice shelves in the ocean, which you notice here, we have coverage of an ice shelf in the ocean, which means the ocean was covered with ice, and it's less dense than water, so it floated. But it covered the ocean down to about 45 degrees latitude. That's half of the northern hemisphere.
Okay.
And the same thing happened in the southern hemisphere. I don't happen to have a map of that. Now, everybody's in agreement that there are actually two requirements for an ice age to occur. The first one is greater snowfall. You have to have more snow than we have today. The second requirement is that you have to have cooler summers. And the idea here is that if you have even a lot of snowfall in the wintertime, in the summer, if it all melts away, it won't continue to accumulate. So the summers have to be colder to preserve the amount of snow and ice that fell in the wintertime. Well, there's a complication here, or a conflict, because it turns out that the amount of water vapor that the air can hold is dependent very strongly on the temperature of the air. The warmer the air is, the more water vapor it can hold, and therefore the more precipitation you have. But if you're warmer than freezing, which here is shown at 0 degrees centigrade, that's the freezing point of water. If you're very much warmer than that, you're not going to get snow, you're going to get rain. So
Right.
It won't form ice sheets and glaciers. On the other hand, if you go below freezing very far, the air can't hold very much water vapor and you don't get much snow. So the conventional idea is that the climate got colder and then produced a lot of snow is in conflict. It can't do that. In fact, you probably have heard the old saying that it's too cold to snow.
Yes, I have.
Okay, that's basically the issue that we have here. The conventional view of trying to implement that uniformitarian model, that there had to be more snow and yet colder temperatures, by modeling that with computer simulations, this is the maximum extent that has been able to simulate the amount of ice coverage in the northern hemisphere. It comes down basically to the middle of the Hudson Bay, not down to the central U.S. here in the Midwest or down into the West Coast or the East Coast.
This is not actual fact. This is a model that's being run.
That's a computer simulation model to try to simulate how the ice age would have developed.
And given their assumptions, you can't make it happen out of Canada.
Right. If you've got cold temperatures, you can't have enough moisture to produce enough snow.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now, you can have individual storms, but it won't accumulate.
Right.
Okay, so here's a really important conflict that we believe we have a solution for, and we developed a biblical model that basically says that after the Genesis flood, because of all the energy of the geological work, the disruption of the continents, the separation of the continents, magma being released from the mantle of the earth into the crust and into the oceans were left much, much warmer than they are today right after the flood. In fact, we have reason to believe that the ocean was as warm as 90 degrees, maybe 100 degrees or more worldwide, not just at the equator, and from the top of the ocean to the bottom. So what you've got is a big pool of warm, actually hot water in the oceans and cold continents. So you have water able to evaporate from the oceans, condense into snow and ice, and fall in the polar regions, on the mountains, and on the continents initially.
So where the moisture's going up, it's warm. And where it's coming down, it's cold. Forgive me for being simplistic,
No,
but that's
it.
the combination you need to make a lot of snow.
That's exactly right. That's the whole idea.
And the flood would have left the world in that condition.
Yes, and we have direct evidence that the oceans were much, much warmer in the past. In fact, if you look at what is traditionally called the Cretaceous period, conventionally thought to be 65 million years ago, the evidence is the temperature of the oceans at that point were on the order of 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
Now, we believe that was just during the Genesis flood. And following that, it cooled off dramatically, but initially it produced the Ice Age in the interim. Now, there's other features in the description in the Bible about the Genesis flood and for several hundred years following it that would contribute to this. Here's a number of these. For example, there was a lot of volcanoes going off, a lot of volcanic dust, which would have contributed to the cooling over the continents. There would have been more cloudiness because of so much water vapor in the air. There would have been barren land. After the flood, when Noah and his family came off the ark on Mount Ararat, the earth was absolutely barren. No trees, no grass.
All the trees have been wiped out by the flood.
It was like it was like landing on the surface of Mars with nothing on there. It was all buried and destroyed. It had to regrow, and it took hundreds of years for that all to come back. In the meantime, that would cause a lot of cooling over the continents as well, because the whole radiation balance would have been changed. In addition to that, as the ice and snow began to accumulate in the northern regions, as you get these large regions of snow and ice, it produced a major cooling effect. Snow cover will cause a reflection of solar radiation during the daytime back to space, and it won't be as effective in heating. And at night, the snow cover is very effective in sending out infrared radiation to space at night and cooling dramatically.
Our coldest nights are always our clearest nights.
Over ice and snow in particular.
Yes, in the
That's
winter,
exactly
yeah.
right. So that would have happened as the snow began to, and ice began to develop over the globe. There also could have been a contribution from a variation in carbon dioxide. In the oceans, right after the flood, all these sediments that went into the ocean were leached of their nutrients. And the nutrients would have fed microorganisms in the ocean, the phytoplankton, which would have grown. There would have been all kinds of plants and grown, and call a bloom, an ocean bloom, which would have taken carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, contributing to the cooling during this ice age as well. Major effect. And there was also a tendency for storms that occurred under these conditions to have fixed storm tracks. They tended to want to skirt around the continents on the earth, which meant that the storm was pumping moisture horizontally from the oceans onto the continents and more effectively dumping it as snow and ice. And finally, because of the high ocean temperatures, you'd have high evaporation, high ocean evaporation. Have you ever heard of the El Nino effect?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we have that quite often in the West Coast in the Pacific Ocean, where there's a little increase in temperature for a few years, 1 or 2 degrees. Here we might be talking about tens of degrees warmer, a giant El Nino effect affecting the whole globe.
Wow.
So there's a number of features here that we believe a biblical model of an ice age is very prevalent. Let me show a diagram here that also illustrates some interesting features in terms of the oceans becoming warm during the flood. We discovered in 1960 something called mid-ocean ridges. Here we have a map of the globe with North America here, and South America, Africa, and Europe. And between these, you find a mid-ocean ridge. It's actually a mountain that runs down through the oceans of the world, comes across south of Australia. This is Australia right here. And it comes under south of Australia, up through the Pacific Ocean, into Mexico.
That's one continuous mountain range that's underwater.
Yes, it's one mountain range. It's about 40,000 miles long.
Wow.
It is also about anywhere up to 6,000 feet high above the bottom of the ocean floor, and hundreds of miles wide in places.
Wow.
Made out of solid magma, hot material that was brought up from the mantle and exposed in the bottom of the ocean. That would have been a major effect in warming the ocean during the flood.
And you're saying that mountain range, that underwater mountain range, developed during the flood?
Yes, I believe it did, and it caused the continents to separate apart as well at the same time.
And that's, we were talking in the green room, that at one point all of the continents were together as one landmass.
We believe the continents were all together, and they separated during the processes of the flood. We're talking about a catastrophic event.
Yeah, everybody just thinks that all that happened in the flood was that we had a lot of water on the earth, but there was a whole lot going on underneath the surface.
That's right. Every time I think about the processes of the flood, it gets more catastrophic.
Yes.
It's just amazing. Here's an example of how this magma would have interacted with the ocean. This is the actual formation of Surtsey, a little island off the coast of Iceland about 30 years ago, where the magma from an underwater volcano came up and erupted and produced all this steam and water and so on. You can see some of that effect today over in the big island of Hawaii, where the lava flows off the volcano into the ocean. Particularly at night, those clouds turn beautiful pink. This is the kind of cloud cover that would have been more prevalent on the earth. During the Genesis flood itself, the whole earth would have been covered with clouds and all kinds of cover. After the flood, it reduced, but there was still a lot more than we have today. Those clouds radiate energy to space in a dramatic way, causing cooling, and that's how the heat in the ocean escaped, and particularly over the continents was much colder than today. Then, as I said, as the snow cover accumulates, it also is very effective in cooling the energy to space. And as it extended out further and further, the cooling was even greater. Until eventually, the ocean cooled down, and the sun was able to begin to predominate and started melting the ice back, and everything ended up in what's called the deglaciation period. And I believe that the ice sheets actually accumulated over a period of about 700 years after the Genesis flood, reached a maximum at that point, and then melted back by the time of Abraham. By the time of Abraham, the Ice Age was very well over.
Date Abraham for us.
He's about 2000 BC.
Okay.
And that would be about 500 to 1,000 years after the time of the flood.
So there's a period of, what'd you say, 700 years after the flood, or when the Ice Age was in progress?
Yeah, it grew from the flood to about 700 years or so, and then melted back by the 1,000 years after the flood.
About 300 years of melting.
That's right.
Wow.
Exactly. To illustrate this formation of an ice age in a kind of a small scale example, I can give you an illustration of an occurrence that happened in Greenland. There was a squadron of B-17s and P-38s that took off from northeastern United States heading to England in 1945. And as they got out in the middle of the Atlantic on the way to England, they found out that their bases in England and in the United States were all fogged in, and they couldn't go to either end or to land. So they buzzed around for a little while and finally crash landed on the southern coast in Greenland. They were rescued after about a week, and the planes were left there. And about 50 years later, a group decided to go and try to rescue those airplanes, because old World War II vintage aircraft are very valuable and people like to collect them. So they went back to Greenland and looked for the planes. They apparently drifted about 10 miles as the ice moved and the glacier heading toward the ocean. So it took a little while to locate it, but not only had they moved horizontally about 10 miles, they were 250 feet down in the ice. Basically, the reason for that is that the Gulf Stream, which is very warm, comes out of the Gulf of Mexico up the eastern coast of the United States, hits Greenland, and then goes across to England.
Right.
And right near the southern tip of Greenland, the ocean is warm, and Greenland is cold, and all this moisture is evaporating out of the ocean and landing as snow and ice on Greenland.
And you're saying that's the exact same condition that we would have had worldwide after the flood?
It would have been globally like that.
Warm water, cold land,
exactly.
Lots of snow.
So the people who were rescuing the airplanes, they dug holes down to the airplane, and they found the airplanes 250 feet down. Here is the P-38.
Wow, look at
down
that.
Still under the ice. They used special equipment to run steam and hot water to melt it out, got down there, and then took the planes apart, cranked them on derricks up out through the holes, brought them back to Kentucky, rebuilt them, and they're flying today, or this particular plane is flying today. It's called Glacier Girl.
Isn't that amazing?
It's a fascinating story. But the point of this is that the conditions there on Greenland with the Gulf Stream coming by illustrates exactly what I think happened globally at the end of the Genesis flood.
We've got to take a break, but don't you go away, Dr. Vardiman, and don't you go away, because we're going to wrap this up with some important points you want to take away from today's origins, so stay right there.
Creation versus evolution, you weigh the evidence. The global flood, a saltwater legacy. The existence of salt lakes and inland seas provides strong evidence that there's been a global flood. The huge salty Caspian Sea is landlocked and has been shrinking in size. Lake Van, near Mount Ararat, and Lake Urmia are excellent examples of high elevation, landlocked salty lakes. How did water get so far inland? Why didn't it dry up a long time ago? A gigantic flood within the last 5,000 years would seem a very good answer.
Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Larry Vardiman, is chairman of the Department of Astrogeophysics at the Institute for Creation Research's Graduate School. Through his ongoing research in atmospheric science, Dr. Vardiman has contributed much to the field of creation science. He also led the RATE team, a research project examining the age of the Earth. This has been documented in the DVD Thousands, Not Billions. For more information, contact the Institute for Creation Research, 1806 Royal Lane, Dallas, Texas, 75229, or call 1-800-337-0375. Or visit the website, www.icr.org.
We're back with Dr. Larry Vardiman talking about the Ice Age and its compatibility to the evidence of God's Word. And Dr. Vardiman, I just want to say that when I'm watching you talk about this subject, I can tell that we're right in your kitchen on this one, that this is right where your training is and where your excitement is. We would ask you to just take this incredible evidence you've given us and give us some conclusions from it.
The first one is that there were extensive ice sheets. I know that some people, because of the conflict between the biblical age and the conventional age, and it's talking about all these ice sheets that have occurred over hundreds of thousands of years, they just say, well, there couldn't have been an ice age. But I think the evidence is very strong that there was. And I think that the evidence is that the Genesis flood is actually what caused it. A second conclusion is that there are major problems in the conventional models. They cannot explain the Ice Age. There's all kinds of attempts to do that, but they're unsuccessful. They have been unable to explain how the Ice Age is formed. And then thirdly, the reason for that is that there needs to be a catastrophic model, and that's what provides the mechanism for the Ice Age to actually develop. And that's what the biblical model does with the Genesis flood. Our biblical model, with all these catastrophic processes going on, volcanoes going off, the major effects of the flood, all these, the continental division, all these things that are going on, this is a catastrophic process that's almost unimaginable in scale and scope. So we have to recognize that that's what's needed in order to be able to initiate the Ice Age.
It isn't billions and billions of years, it's one big catastrophe that really makes the difference.
Right, and we're still recovering from that to some degree, but it took a long time for that to happen, but the Ice Age was the initial stage of that recovery.
Okay.
And then the biblical model that we have fits that idea very, very well. And I think what's exciting about this is a creationist opportunity to be able to explain a solution to a very interesting mystery that has not been explained adequately by uniformitarian explanations. And we have it now from a biblical model because of the catastrophe that was produced by the Genesis flood.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vardiman, for sharing with us. I just want to say to our people that you have a monograph that's available that for our viewers that want to look into this at a deeper level. Tell them how they would get a hold of that.
Sure, this is a monograph that I wrote for my graduate students, but it's readily available to anybody who would like to have it. It's online at icr.org.
icr.org, and just look for Dr. Vardiman, and I'm sure you'll find this research that excited him. Above all, I want you to remember this until you're with us next time. It's God's view that He created you, and that should be your worldview too. Join us next time again, won't you, for Origins.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 802 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program number 802, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.